This is Criteria. Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I am your host, Thomas Miras, and we're doing things a little differently today. My normal co-host, James Majewski, is not with me. That's because he is just in a very busy period right now with work, and he's going to be traveling for most of July, and needs time to focus on his other podcast, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, get some things in the can for that, and also work on fundraising, which he does for Catholic culture. So I just decided to let him off the hook for Criteria for a few episodes, but it's an opportunity to work on a little mini project that I've been wanting to do for a while. And I'll be joined by my guest co-host who often joins us here, Nathan Douglas. Welcome back, Nathan.
Hello, Thomas. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this mini project.
So this little project is going to last us 2 or 3 episodes, and then in August we'll probably resume our normal, film discussions with James. But basically, what we're going to be doing is to look at what official church teachings exist that relate to cinema. We of course spent the first 3 years of this podcast going through the Vatican Film List, which is an official document, but not a magisterial teaching document. But there are actually some earlier documents that are magisterial that are about film. There's an encyclical by Pope Pius XI. There's an apostolic exhortation by Pope Pius XII and another encyclical by him that includes some things about film. And then there's some stuff about modern media in general in Vatican II. And so we thought it would be worth taking a look and trying to put these things in their historical context and understand what we can get from them today, both in terms of the actual doctrinal content, such as it is, and also the more kind of like prudential and, time and place specific stuff that'll be interesting to look at for the history of the church's engagement with film and what we can learn about it. So this episode is going to be focused on the magisterium of Pope Pius XI, and we'll be pretty much just dealing with his encyclical on the motion picture Vigilanti, cura, which was published on June 29th, 1936, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, which is actually coming up for us in a few days here, now that I think of it. And I guess just a very general statement, this document is very much of a moral character, but also very much of a practical moral character. It is concerned not just with sort of establishing moral principles, but with putting them into action within a particular time and place, and very much with regard to happenings in the United States of America. And that brings us to the background of this document and the person who actually wrote it for Pius XI. So Nathan, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So the person you are referring to, I believe, is Father Daniel Lord, S.J., who was a priest, American priest, who had a very busy life from what we understand in a number of kind of endeavors, especially in, I guess, the larger field of what we would call Catholic action. The whole kind of empowering of the laity in the late 19th or early 20th century. I think it took a while maybe for Catholic action to kind of, started in Europe and then kind of takes a while to really get into the U.S. But by the time that Father Lord is exercising his ministry, he's in the 1910s, 1920s. He gets very busy writing a lot of pamphlets, writing a lot of treatments of different subjects. And he was particularly interested in the arts and in theater. But through his various media activities, he kind of came to the attention of other figures who were also concerned with the state of film and what does film mean, the moral effects of film, this young medium that was developing. And so, through a number of events and associations with other figures, most key one would be a fellow named Martin Quigley, who, that would be for discussion, another episode on the production code and the Legion of Decency, perhaps. But Father Lord and Martin Quigley, who was a film critic and a publisher, collaborated on writing what we call the production code, or it was adopted by Hollywood studios in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Their first effort to censor themselves so that the state would not censor them.
Right.
And so partly through those efforts and basically Father Lord was established as a significant authority on this question. And so at some point he was asked to, from what we understand, there seems to be a bit of disagreement amongst the historians because Martin Quigley's son is adamant in interviews and later in life that his father is the ghostwriter of Vigilanti cura, but it seems that the scholarship points to the stronger case being for Father Lord. So it seems to be pretty accepted, I think, now that Father Lord is the ghostwriter of Vigilanti cura.
My understanding is he also had a hand in the founding of the Legion of Decency a few years after the production code. This encyclical makes reference to both. The other thing worth mentioning about his background is before his writing of the first draft of the production code is what he wrote, because certainly later editions of the production code had things that he didn't put into it. But he also had done work in Hollywood as, I guess, a kind of consultant, like a story consultant, and particularly with the great director Cecil B. DeMille, who did a number of sort of like historical and biblical epics, and most notably Father Lord worked with DeMille on his 1927 silent film The King of Kings, which is the only DeMille film that I've seen, but that was a famous film based on the gospel of the time. And, Father Lord's influence included things like getting him to drastically shorten the Mary Magdalene and Judas romance subplot, because the idea is basically that the reason that Judas betrays Jesus is that he had been having an affair with Mary Magdalene before her repentance, and then when Jesus converts her, he gets upset. Something like that. I don't remember it that well, but I do remember like there's this long, very distasteful sequence at the beginning of the film of Mary Magdalene pre-conversion dancing around scantily clad, this kind of like exploitative thing that people got away with on like quote unquote historical grounds in some of the old biblical epics. And, Father Lord got DeMille to shorten that stuff and take a lot of it out. And DeMille ended up agreeing with him that like we don't really need the Judas, and Jesus is so powerful that we don't need all this like silly like nonsense subplot. So good on Father Lord for that. So he had a real appointment. He had a real experience in Hollywood, and DeMille even wanted to pay him quite a bit to come back out to Hollywood later on and like work with him on like an ongoing basis. But Lord didn't feel that was his calling. And so he declined the offer, but they remained friends. So he was a respected consultant at a time when, having the clergy give you input was important for films on religious subjects. So is there anything else we should say by way of background or context?
Yeah, I think just it would be helpful to mention the general context with a couple nuances. First, the history of cinema is as complex as kind of every culture, every national culture, every all the kinds of cultures that come into contact with cinema produces all sorts of complex effects. So we can't, it's hard to generalize, but it's very significant that this document comes out in 1936. It's within. Let's see, can I do math? It's within 40 years of the invention of the moving image. If we take, 1895 as kind of the traditional birth of the cinema moment. And so a lot has happened, a lot happens in those first few decades. The medium develops extremely quickly, kind of going through epochal changes, like from, just the shock of the moving image, of the ability to record time and matter in this way, to almost immediately the application of using it to tell stories, to bring a narrative component into it, and that takes over, that takes off. A very successful industry is built up around this. The moral questions that come with that, with, what do we show, what do we don't show, that becomes a live wire question very quickly. And spectacle, scale, and then of course the talking picture, what was a silent image by the late 1920s into the 1930s is transforming very rapidly into the recording of sound as well as image. And all of a sudden we have this kind of complete simulation of reality before us. So the fact that Vigilanti Cura, comes out kind of at the end of this roller coaster of the development of the moving image, and the moving image doesn't stop developing it keeps developing past this point, to our own day. But there is a certain kind of uniqueness to that chapter of it was really, really changing a lot. And so everybody was kind of going, what's up? Everyone was scrambling to kind of figure out what's going on here. Everyone from, what can we do? What can't we do? What can't we show? Is this corrupting the minds of the young? Is it corrupting the minds of the mature? Is it making people more stupid? Is it making people less able to think?
Yeah.
And so if you read some of the film criticism by Catholics in the 1920s, there's comments by, Catholic film critics, including priests, talking about, what is this film thing? Is it just vulgar? Is it not? And certainly from the early 1920s, we definitely see Catholics are already wrestling with it as something that is good but being misused. Probably earlier, right around maybe 20 years before that point, early 1900s, there's probably more skepticism in general about this being something that had any kind of lofty potential to it. But this is something that, changed over time as film developed.
Right.
People's opinions of it, including opinions of those in the church and in the hierarchy, saw that this could be used for great good. But there's a very common lament amongst a lot of these comments that, in general, it's not being used very well. Right. And that's partly because the film industry, certainly in the US and in the UK, in the English speaking world, and in Europe and pretty much everywhere, I think it's pretty safe to say, the film industry developed without a strong or without any kind of Catholic or even Christian influence. And so there's a sense in a lot of these writings leading up to the 1930s of, Catholics and Protestant commentators kind of just, lamenting almost like, how did we kind of drop the plot on this, like how something, this thing kind of was just happened and we're kind of left out. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting historical context for us to look at, because we're still in that situation today
with new things.
Yeah, it hasn't changed. If I think some Catholics who like movies, especially classic Hollywood, they'll look back and they'll say, oh, look back at 1940s, Song of Bernadette, and it was this golden age of cinema. And it was a golden age of cinema, don't get me wrong. But it wasn't a golden age of Catholic cinema. There never really has been a golden age of Catholic cinema. And there's been wonderful outliers and wonderful films that have come out of kind of each period of history, but they tend to be exceptions. And so I think it helps for us to remember that the church was kind of, taking a wait and see approach, I think, to this. Maybe the last thing I'll just say for context is this document comes in a period of film history where the pervading kind of concern from a scientific point of view is about this. It's really in the realm of sociology and like sort of mass psychology. And it's looking at what is this doing to culture? What is this doing to society? To the point where in the US, there's a very significant series of studies that were funded in the late 1920s, early 1930s by spearheaded by a Protestant minister, is called the Pain Fund Studies. And they commissioned a series of studies, especially to look at the effects of the cinema on children, to see if there was some kind of scientific link that can be established between film and like juvenile delinquency, or film and just various other, maybe like poor education. Right. Like, so there's all this concern about scientifically getting a handle on film, and really trying to address it it was seen as a sociocultural kind of malady by many. And then some saw it as just kind of an entertainment form that maybe wasn't being used as well as it could have been. And then there were some, certainly among filmmakers and some critics, who saw it as a legitimate art form that could be held up in the same category as the fine arts. And so all this is kind of like at play, and no one's really kind of drawn strong boundaries or distinctions yet on kind of where this is. And that's kind of where this documents like the first kind of really universal Catholic response to this whole question.
And I'm assuming by the time that this encyclical comes out, the situation has developed to the point where people are going to the movies a lot, right? A lot, far, far, far more than we do now. I mean, television kind of, and all the other things that have developed since then kind of started that. But people would go every weekend, some people multiple times a week. There'd be double features, triple features, a lot of time spent in the theater. So it was a much more like pervasively formative influence than we might expect in a time prior to home video. But it was just very common and often inexpensive, to go to the theater.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's just analogous to maybe the thing we could compare it to the most today would be maybe the phenomenon in our day of infinite scrolling, or just being online all the time. I think it's hard for us to imagine, because it's a physical act of like going to the theater, and maybe because our, the way that in our neighborhoods today, like the neighborhood theater isn't really a thing anymore for most people. You have to drive to a multiplex or something. But for, this was a very easy thing for people to do. And they would do, as you said, multiple times a week. It was how they got their news. It was how they got their cartoon. They got their entertainment, they got the kind of whole program of stuff plus, feature films. And it's kind of the same as, us spending, all day on Twitter and, maybe checking into YouTube and, when we think about like comparable, something that's reshaping the consciousness of people, and they were already very quickly reshaped into, this is the thing to do. This is our relaxation. Right. This is how we this is our leisure, basically. And even one last point, just to tie into that, there was a real, there wasn't a fussiness around it in terms of, nowadays thankfully we're used to, there's a certain set of manners that go with watching a film. You're not supposed to talk, or, I know that I've seen a lot of complaints that people are not, more and more, there seems to be this social contract is kind of like relaxing in a lot of places.
That hasn't been my experience.
But in the old days, in this period of history that we're talking about, it was very normal. You could just kind of buy your ticket, wander in, leave when you want. People would be kind of it was just, people would come to hang out. It was a hangout place. It wasn't kind of come in and get this like work of art and then you really behold it. It was, you kind of come in, you kill time, and then you can kind of leave whenever, or you could stay and watch it again. Or there's stories of, mothers, their kids are, they come down to the theater to like find their kids.
Right.
Cause they don't know where they went, and they got into the show and they've been at the theater all day. It's that kind of thing. It was very casual. It's a very casual thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to go through the document, section by section. It's not a super long encyclical. But before we do that, just for our listeners, this podcast is produced by CatholicCulture.org, and it can only happen because people donate. This podcast, of all of our foreign podcasts, has the fewest viewers, and probably by that token, the fewest donors listening to it. But if you are one of those happy few, the band of brothers who listens to this podcast and really values that there's something like this out there, I would ask you to really consider donating, and actually a step further, to consider becoming a monthly donor, setting up a monthly pledge on our website, even for a small amount, would be very helpful for us in considering how we allocate resources to our different aspects of our website and the different podcasts going forward. Something for which I feel more and more responsibility since I'm running the website now. I have to think about, what we're putting our money into and our work hours into. So I really want to keep this going and have this be a robust podcast for a long time. So please do consider going to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. And we will really appreciate that. I do pray for our donors and all of our listeners every day. Okay, so let's get into this bad boy here. So right away, he puts us in the context of he's talking to the bishops. He's kind of taking the situation in America and using it as an example for the bishops around the world, because he's quite pleased, or the author. The author, Daniel Lord S.J., who also happened to help to found the Legion of Decency and write the production code, so no wonder the encyclical that he ghost wrote is also taking a very positive view towards those things and setting them as the example for the rest of the church to follow. But Pius XI starts out right away by saying he's very pleased to learn about the fruits and the progress made by, he says, that prudent initiative launched more than 2 years ago as a holy crusade against the abuses of the motion pictures and entrusted in a special manner to the Legion of Decency. So he starts out by thanking the hierarchy of the United States and the faithful who cooperated with them for the good that had already been done by the Legion of Decency. But the first large section of this encyclical is kind of like an overview of what had been going on up to this point. Pius starts out by referring back to a couple of his previous comments on the motion picture. For example, he says in the encyclical Divini Illius Magistri, we had already deplored that potent instrumentalities of publicity, such as the cinema, which might be of great advantage to learning and to education, were they properly directed by healthy principles, often unfortunately serve as an incentive to evil passions and are subordinated to sordid gain. Then in 1934, he had given an address to a delegation of the International Federation of the Motion Picture Press. He says this in this previous address, quote, "We pointed out the very great importance which the motion picture has acquired in our days and its vast influence alike in the promotion of good and in the insinuation of evil, and we called to mind that it is necessary to apply to the cinema the supreme rule which must direct and regulate the great gift of art in order that it may not find itself in continual conflict with Christian morality or even with simple human morality based on the natural law." So what is this supreme rule he speaks of? He goes on, "The essential purpose of art, its raison d'etre, is to assist in the perfection of the moral personality, which is man, and for this reason, it must itself be moral." And he goes on to say that the motion picture must be made moral, an influence for good morals, an educator. So starting out with this supreme rule, which must direct and regulate the great gift of art in order that it may not find itself in continual conflict with Christian morality, etc. Yeah, the essential purpose of art is to assist in the perfection of the moral personality.
Well, I think this is maybe where you're going with this, but is this the first definition of art in a magisterial document?
Quite possibly, but I don't know. I mean, he didn't define art, but he defined its essential purpose. Now, I mean, this can be taken in a number of ways. First of all, I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure how authoritative we should take this as like a definition of the purpose of art. I mean, I'm honestly not sure does the church teach on that kind of thing. Is that like sort of an area of church teaching? It may be. Certainly, the church can teach that it must not find itself in conflict with Christian morality or with simple human morality. I think that's the key point. Is like obviously, art must be moral, even if its essential purpose were not to assist in the perfection of the moral personality, which is man. But let's just like take this, at face value. The traditional sort of scholastic definition of art does not have the human good as its end, but that's talking about the virtue of art, the habit of art. Whereas I think that, Pius is talking about sort of the work of art, the sort of the category of art. And so even if the virtue of art, its end is not, is not in itself, its proximate end is not the moral good of man, you might still ask, okay, so like, why did God give us this gift though? Is it really just for its own sake? And I think the answer has to be no. I mean, you could say that it's its raison d'etre is to glorify God, but I think this passage benefits from a broad reading of the sense of the perfection of the moral personality. I mean, he says the moral personality, which is man. So he defines man as the moral personality, which is kind of interesting in itself. But, morality can be, you could take it in such a way that kind of detracts from the sort of the value that art has as something in itself, which sort of just is good, and glorifies God and maybe exists on a level that transcends our moral actions from day to day. But I think it makes more sense to read this as saying, if the good of man is contemplating God, and we were to give a more sort of contemplative role to cinema, I think that you can fairly count that as a moral good, probably. It may not be in the sort of like colloquial sense that we normally use that term, right, of moral, but I think that insofar as it has to do with the ends of man, it certainly has to do with virtues, right? I don't know. I don't feel the need to kind of like, I think just giving this a sufficiently broad sense of what the moral personality means is probably good enough to read this in a way that doesn't have like an overly constrictive view of cinema as this kind of like moralistic art form. However, I think it's also true that this is very much, as you said, this point of view is very much formed by what cinema is and had been shown to be, at this time, which is like basically a narrative art
narrative
form.
And propagandistic.
Narrative and
There's a
propagandistic.
propagandistic quality to much of the cinema that's being made in this period, even ones that aren't explicitly propaganda. I was just reading an interesting Blackfriars essay from I think it was 1930, 1929, that was talking about the writer, a priest named Father C.C. Martindale, a Jesuit. He was talking about every film has a propagandistic quality to it, including the ones from the U.S. that are, expressing the kind of the American life, the American dream. They're only showing the American dream in its best sense, as swanky life, cocktails and Fifth Avenue. And this writer and others of the time were commenting on people watching these films in, Eastern Europe and trying to get to immigrating to the U.S., partly influenced by the imagery that they were seeing in American films, even if they weren't intended to be propagandistic, kind of in their primary purpose. There's still a kind of normalizing effect of like the way these images, obviously you have to choose what images you're going to show in any kind of film, and it's the effects of that, kind of admitting the effects of that can be very blunt, or they can be very unnuanced. And so that's definitely a feature, or that's definitely what we see in the films of this period. There can be great subtlety in certain aspects, but people are being formed by them in ways that this is kind of like the great age of the mass society, and this is the mass art of the mass society.
But the other thing I was going to say about this is like, are we talking about proximate ends? Are we talking about, a more broad end? Because we can say the essential purpose of everything is to give glory to God. And if the glory of God is man fully alive, then we can say that the purpose of all human activities in some sense is the perfection of man, whatever that may be. And he's emphasizing the moral aspect, because ultimately man cannot be perfected without that. What he says is that it must be moral, and that's a pretty obvious thing unless you're like Oscar Wilde or something. And then he says that the motion picture must be made moral and influence for good morals and educator. And I think that's where you might kind of, balk a little bit in thinking that, a movie has to be an educator. Because that makes it sound awfully like something very didactic or propagandistic. But
Mhm.
again, I think there's a way, as blunt as this language is, and as blunt and maybe crude a form as this educational function of film often took in this era, I think you can still read that in a kind of a universal sense as like, okay, with like the sort of like the highest and broadest sense of education, and still like come away with something that's essentially true, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think as a filmmaker, especially as a Catholic filmmaker, and that's a term that's kind of a lot of people have opinions about, justifiable opinions about, what that means. There's a lot of, we don't really know what that means. There's no real kind of consensus. But one of the tensions that comes up with trying to find direction as a Catholic and in your filmmaking practice, if you look towards the magisterium and the first thing you kind of read is this moral emphasis from this day and age that we're in right now, that I think there's a knee-jerk tendency a lot of people, including myself, have had, where you fear that means, it's going to be didactic. It's going to eclipse the complexity of reality. It's going to eclipse the complexity of telling a story about realistic human situations,
Right.
that require a moral dimension or that are deeply tied up with explicating the moral dimension of human life. But there's a fear, which we're still, especially in Hollywood influenced kind of cultures, and part of that's because we won't have time to get into it, but that's partly because of the ways in which the production code kind of like didn't help in some ways. Topic for another time. But there's this hangover that kind of Western filmmakers have with regards to trying to make something that is realistic and good. And so I think we have a tendency to read exhortations of this nature as being overly simplistic, when really what this is very general. The way that I interpret this is it's a very general overview of the big picture principles. And it's unquestionable that, of course, like if film has a good use, a good purpose in the history in salvation history, of course it's going to be supportive of our universal end, of what we're made for, loving union with God. So a good film will, in some sense, support that, and it must, in some sense, support that. And without, if we think of them, I don't want to think of films necessarily in terms of composites of like, oh, here's all the bad stuff and here's all the good stuff. But obviously, a film that is more vicious, in its end, is going to have a very hard time doing that. And if it's so vicious that it can't be admitted, then of course, then we have a good sense of what a bad film is. So I think I guess what I'm saying is I think there's a lot of room within what he's laying out here, even though it's a very, it sounds very didactic, but I think there's a lot of room to interpret the whole history of cinema, fitting into this.
I think whenever you're talking about like the purpose of art or the purpose of a particular art form, or whether art is supposed to be quote unquote for its own sake, or for the glory of God, or for the salvation of souls, I think so much depends on distinguishing between like the proximate end and like sort of the way in which any given art form is supposed to do that. And it's just the case that not every art or craft that human beings do has an immediately moral end, but because they exist in this moral context, and the end of man is of a moral nature, they all, insofar as they serve that end indirectly, can serve a moral end. And so I think that but we can read all of these statements in such a way as respects the special spheres of work that the arts are supposed to be in, so that you don't have to say, well, that if a song doesn't have Christian lyrics, then it's not building the kingdom of God on earth or something like that. And I think you can see that pretty clearly, that the church that is taught more clearly in something like John Paul II's letter to artists. I think it's pretty clear that when artists are faithful to their vocations, he believes that they are able to serve the kingdom of God, even when they're not immediately dealing with religious topics, for instance.
I think it's important to emphasize that, and even when down the road when we do Pope Pius XII writings, we'll see a similar dynamic where he's elucidating a lot of general principles that, again, depending on what period of history you're in, that you're looking at this from, it's very easy to read a lot of your own baggage back into what those are. Right. But they're very broad, and I'm so grateful that we have the letter to artists, because I think it does clarify and really kind of brings out aspects of these general principles in the magisterial teaching on cinema that without that, it would be very easy to interpret it as the only thing Catholic films are good for are documentaries, about saints or pious subjects, and nothing against those things. If you, listener or viewer, if you detect an edge in my voice, it is you can probably discern that that is not for me the height of cinema, but it's interesting in the history of Catholics making films. That's there throughout the whole history, including even after this document comes out and Catholic action organizations really start to get involved with filmmaking. Often the films that they're promoting, especially in like the 40s and 50s, when this really kind of hits a peak of activity, they tend to be religious documentaries, like about a pilgrimage to this site or something about Fatima or something. So sometimes as a filmmaker from the 2020s who is maybe steeped in the European spiritual cinephile tradition of like sort of like religious humanism and subtleties of art and poetry and all that, it's sometimes hard to look back on that and go, it seems like the only people thought that film was good for, from a Catholic point of view, is to do these kind of like instructional, catechetical or documentary works. Those are a fact that happened for a reason and they have a place, but that's by no means the only use of cinema.
So, Pius is continuing to, look at the past several years leading up to this encyclical, and he says, "It is a certainty which can be readily be verified that the more marvelous the progress of the motion picture art and industry, the more pernicious and deadly has it shown itself to morality and to religion, and even to the very decencies of human society." Very strong blanket statement. Interesting, that later we see John Paul II in his speech for the 100th anniversary of cinema in 1995 saying, the church's judgment of this art form is on the whole positive. But of course, by that time, I don't think you can say that the moral situation is any better, probably much worse than the one that, Pius XI was decrying then. So I think that's simply, Matt, like a shift in like the way that the church attempts to like work with the world and encourage it. Anyway, I think it's just like a shift in emphasis and sort of pastoral tact there.
It's that, and it's also the evidence of, like, again, we'll get into this with the Pius XII stuff, but there, the late 1940s, 50s, were this merging of like Catholic principles with the form of film. Like that's how neorealism is a strong argument to be made, that neorealism is a fundamentally Catholic kind of style.
Okay.
And so I think there was a lot of things changed between 1936 and the end of World War II, to really bring cinema formally within kind of like a Catholic ethos.
So Pope Pius mentions the motion picture production code coming into play in 1930, but he says that promise of self-censorship was not carried out. And therefore, the Legion of Decency was born. For those who don't know about the Legion of Decency, I'll read his description, which is a good summary of the kind of things that they were doing. Quote, "Your leadership," meaning the bishops, "called forth the prompt and devoted loyalty of your faithful people, and millions of American Catholics signed the pledge of the Legion of Decency, binding themselves not to attend any motion picture which is offensive to Catholic moral principles or proper standards of living. We are thus able to proclaim joyfully that few problems of these latter times have so closely united bishops and people as the one resolved by cooperation in this holy crusade. Not only Catholics, but also high-minded Protestants, Jews, and many others accepted your lead and joined their efforts with yours in restoring wise standards, both artistic and moral, to the cinema." So the Legion of Decency was rating films, as many people know, but they also would have people in parishes take this pledge, which I think was voluntary, but maybe there was also some kind of like obligation of obedience to your bishop anyway, even if you didn't take the pledge, depending on what the bishop wanted to do. Not to watch films that had been condemned, or, not to allow your children to see, films that had been deemed appropriate only for adults, etc. So Pius is very happy with the success of this crusade, this word that he keeps using. Again, goes to show just like the vast difference between, the culture of the church then and now. So he says that because of your vigilance and because of the pressure which has been brought to bear by public opinion, the motion picture has shown an improvement from the moral standpoint. Crime and vice are portrayed less frequently. Sin is no longer so openly approved and acclaimed. False ideals of life are no longer presented in so flagrant a manner to the impressionable minds of youth. And without getting into, the details of pre-code films or, films under the early code, basically, from what I understand, a big part of the issue is, they were just throwing sex into films a lot to sell, and B, they were the subject of matter of films was just increasingly tawdry. Like, it was either like sexual, or they were all like gangster films, a lot of revenge films, and just a lot of like morally problematic stuff. But the argument made by Catholic opponents of these kinds of films and proponents of the code and the Legion was basically that the film industry had gotten really lazy, that there was like this crisis in creativity in the film industry where they were basically just trying to draw people in with this lowest common denominator material, and there was less and less variety in the plots, less and less stuff that sort of the whole family could see, as people complain about now, and that there was just kind of less artistic excellence, and that people were actually losing interest in going to the movies, because of that, because they were sort of getting sick of the same stuff and just sort of having such negative insinuations being made about society and all the films that they were watching. But, that's something to go into more detail about in a separate discussion.
I think this is worth mentioning. The PreCode era, is 1930 to 1934, and so it's coming on the heels of the stock market crash.
Well, the code was 1930.
The movie business. Yeah, the code was written and introduced in 1930, but it wasn't enforced until 1934. So what we think of as the PreCode era refers specifically to these 4 years where Hollywood said, we're going to...
I thought it was all the pre-code
No,
years.
it's only 1930 to 34. It's so because it basically is the period where Hollywood said, okay, we're gonna police ourselves, and then they don't.
Oh.
And instead of not only did they not police themselves, but they doubled down on salacious subjects and material, and in some cases nudity, violence. This is the era of Little Caesar and Scarface, for those who know those films, which nowadays don't seem, in terms of violence, maybe don't seem as violent to us today. But, if you actually try to watch a movie like Scarface, try to put yourself in that position and just take it for what it is. It's an incredibly violent film. Doesn't have to be graphically violent in terms of, blood everywhere or whatever, but it's a very intense experience. But
interesting.
Anyway, so the pre-codes were they're partly a bid to excite, the audience, excite the lower passions, but they're also dealing with the stock market, the loss of business with the stock market crash. And then also the other thing is you mentioned the artistic qualities kind of dropping. I think that's also partly tied to the talkie, the talking film is introduced. And so because recording sound was so cumbersome, the fluid way of making films, the moving camera, very kind of fluid sense of the visual style, that really, once microphones were introduced, that really kind of stopped and it slowed down until technicians could figure out how to actually move the camera and move mics at the same time. And, by the mid 1930s, that starts to get more sophisticated again. But there was this period where everything became like a filmed play almost. And so there's an argument to be made that maybe audiences were getting kind of tired of formally seeing the same kind of stuff over and over. So how do you compensate? Well, let's put more, obscene kind of content, or salacious, or just excitable. It's very comparable. He used the term marvelous, in the document, the more marvelous, here we hear the same, we could say in the same way, spectacle, there's like a very strong sense of the sort of traditional Christian condemnation of spectacle that we see in the early church fathers of like the Roman, circuses and the plays and the, just like the sordid displays that the early Christians were, supposed to stay away from. We see a very similar kind of like tone here. And like this idea that these are marvels in the sense of trying to excite the base passions. They're not, spectacles in the more generous reading of, hey, we love Tolkien, we love Return of the King, that's a beautiful spectacle. It's like, he's not talking about that. We're not talking about spectacle purely like as a beautiful thing. It's like, marvels that are meant to incite the passions.
Right.
So I think it's important to kind of clarify that, because again, we could look back and go, hey, what does that really mean?
So section 2 of the encyclical out of 3, the power of the cinema. So he's going to talk about why the cinema is so influential. He starts out by talking about recreation. He says, recreation in its manifold varieties has become a necessity for people who work under the fatiguing conditions of modern industry, but it must be worthy of the rational nature of man and therefore must be morally healthy. It must be elevated to the rank of a positive factor for good and must seek to arouse noble sentiments. A people who in time of repose give themselves to diversions which violate decency, honor, or morality, to recreations which, especially to the young, constitutes an occasion of sin, are in grave danger of losing their greatness and even their national power. I think that the thing to emphasize here is just the idea that the church doesn't want us to just have, pure recreation. It wants it to be actually of a positive and noble value. And he goes on to talk about the passive power of cinema. He says that the cinema is the most powerful means of the time of influencing the masses. And that he says the power of the motion picture consists in this, that it speaks by means of vivid and concrete imagery which the mind takes in with enjoyment and without fatigue. Even the crudest and most primitive minds, which have neither the capacity nor the desire to make the efforts necessary for abstraction or deductive reasoning, are captivated by the cinema. In place of the effort which reading or listening demands, there is a continued pleasure of a succession of concrete and, so to speak, living pictures. And then he says that power is even greater in the talking picture because of it's easier to interpret and there's music. And so the kind of the passive power is like that it requires less effort. It's addressing more of the senses than if you're just reading a book or if you're, say, listening to music or a radio program or something like that. And so it tends to sort of be easier to just sort of shut down and watch a movie. And I think we've all experienced this. Even for me, I tend to be very passive when watching, even the most challenging movies. And that may be a good thing, that may be being receptive. But I find that like, even when I'm doing a second or third viewing of a movie, say for this podcast, like, I'll sometimes be like, okay, I'm going to really pay attention to, like the cutting or like camera angles on this viewing. And that only lasts for like a few minutes. And then I just sort of just get drawn into it and I'm just watching it. Like it might as well be my first viewing, that happens to me a lot. Like I find that I don't maintain that kind of like that analytical distance for very long. So
the line about the continued pleasure of a succession of concrete and, so to speak, living pictures. I was saying earlier how there isn't much like film theory is still a very early discipline at this point, barely even that. And it's interesting. I think here we have maybe the first magisterial kind of stab at a film theory. Getting down to the essence of kind of what is the film image, what is its power. And I love that description actually of like concrete and, so to speak, living pictures, because there's, film wouldn't really matter if it wasn't so appealing to us as a realistic art form. And, maybe a topic for, another time getting into the intricacies of it. But I think that has a lot to say to Catholic filmmakers, about kind of what is the relationship of reality to what you're doing, what is the relationship of reality to the power of cinema? What kind of power of it all comes back to this this relationship, and it's at the heart of things. So I love that, he puts it so succinctly and in this, this paragraph. I think it does capture that. There's a lot there to be mined from that.
So Pope Pius moves on to the consideration of cinema as a mass art, which is an important point, and that's something that has definitely developed since this time period, and so it's worth talking about. So he says the above considerations, quote, take on greater seriousness from the fact that the cinema speaks not to individuals but to multitudes, and that it does so in circumstances of time and place and surroundings which are most apt to arouse unusual enthusiasm for the good as well as for the bad, and to conduce to that collective exaltation which, as experience teaches us, may assume the most morbid forms. The motion picture is viewed by people who are seated in a dark theater and whose faculties, mental, physical, and often spiritual, are relaxed. One does not need to go far in search of these theaters. They are close to the home, to the church, and to the school, and they thus bring the cinema into the very center of popular life. So I want to stop there. Of course, you were talking about the ease that people could attend movies with at this time. Of course, that's even more the case viewing movies at home, but at the same time, it sort of tempers this picture of cinema as something that is viewed sort of collectively and indiscriminately by a mass audience. Granted, the theater experience is still a very important part of cinema and one that we want to promote, but even in that context, I think the variety of types of theaters and just the rating system, which didn't exist at the time, it tempers the idea that cinema has to be appropriate for all ages because it's a mass art, or for all types of people. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot we could talk about there.
Yeah, for sure. And this is, again, reflective of the development of cinema. When it was first started to be rolled out to audiences, it was a sideshow. It was seen as, just an amusement, akin to like a circus act or something. And only over time, once filmmakers started to demonstrate the sophistication that was possible with it, did, proponents of higher culture, we might say, would start to take notice and say, hey, actually, there's something here that is much more complex than like a vaudeville act or something like that. So it's interesting that this is, again, reflective of like film's development is kind of stumbling into significance. It's kind of stumbling into being kind of more than it's expected to be. And then all of a sudden we have this problem of like, oh, kids have been going to this, from the beginning, the Nickelodeon, the idea of like sort of like the nickel theater, it's the thing that the kids do, it's not for adults. It's not for thinking, cultured people. So now we have this problem where all the kids are used for over a generation. The kids are going to this kind of entertainment, and it, and of course, being in this mass setting, there's a parallel to the liturgy. There's parallel to theater, as you mentioned, but theater, already has kind of the cultural trappings. The opera, like, there's already these cultural trappings of kind of who's that for. It's not necessarily for everybody. But what is the other kind of mass event of attendance and focus and attention and, senses being kind of entranced, engaged, the very obvious parallel is the liturgy. And some commentators even have, gone so far as to compare the cinema explicitly to the liturgy as kind of like the liturgy of the 20th century and those kinds of terms. So I think you can definitely detect that aspect there of psychologically, here is this new form, just kind of didn't come out of nowhere, but it certainly felt like it came out of nowhere, stormed onto the scene, and now it's really having this effect on people that really only the Divine Liturgy up to that point kind of, and maybe some theatrical spectacles, would have that effect.
Yeah, there's this guy, Stephen Werner, an academic who has written quite a bit about Father Daniel Lord, including his involvement with the Legion of Decency and Hollywood in general. And he pointed out that, at the time of the production code and the Legion, there wasn't a rating system for movies such as we have today, which sort of cordons them off for different age groups and even has like a legal backing behind it for who's allowed to see what kinds of movies in the theater. Now, of course, that has pretty much broken down, in terms of like that being enforced and that being sort of reliable, for Catholic parents, obviously, but at a time when there was no kind of regimentation of films, different films with different ratings in that way. Mm-hmm. You just kind of had the way they were talking about it is as though like it has to be appropriate for all films must be appropriate for the whole family to view. And granted, like the opposite can be overemphasized, like the idea that, well, it's okay, permissiveness because something is directed towards like adults, where adult cinema can be like, not adult cinema, but like cinema for adults can be just like mature, trashier, Yeah. It's still, that still is an important point because some of the things in the code, where certain whole ranges of subject matter are basically closed off, mm-hmm. or like you have to have like an obvious kind of defeat for the bad guy and things like that, are things that, the church would not demand of, the novel, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. So there's an expectation at this time, from like the sort of the guardians of social morality that films have like a special onus on them to be like very clear in their morality. And granted, like that's also a case of the medium itself being different. Like film is more powerful. The images can sort of bypass your mm-hmm. like nuanced appreciation of like the textual content of the film, such that like the image itself has more power. That's something that we've talked about on previous episodes where we've talked about like depictions of sexuality in film, where like even if the intent is clearly to like critique sexual deviancy or something, its portrayal can sort of run counter to that in the effect on the viewer. Mm-hmm. So there are intrinsic differences between film and other media, but nonetheless, I think that what we see here is like definitely like a more primitive like stage in the development of film and the appreciation of film as something that's capable of being like a high art form, or like a sophisticated art form, like literature. Don't you think?
Yeah. The seeds are definitely there. And, I think it's one of the benefits of, or one of the, maybe the reliefs that I would feel as a filmmaker reading this document from years later is that it makes the general principle very clear without kind of going into the specifics the way like the production code does,
right. Yes.
And again, I'm kind of overstepping into production code topic territory, but I think it's very relevant. Part of the tension of Catholic artists today, especially those in literature and especially those in film, specifically with film in the West, is again this hangover of kind of the deficiencies of the production code or the overstepping nature of the production code, where basically if film is a medium that is particularly suited to expressing reality, imaging reality, there are whole areas of reality that were kind of completely off limits because of the fear that just to even treat them even in a negative sense would have would provoke a imitative response from an audience, or it would maybe desensitize them to a moral evil, right. Even if they're right. Disapproving of it. And I think there's a certain kind of maybe a lack of maybe it's like an infantilization there, of what audiences are, or at least what people are actually capable of. I'm not saying it was totally imprudent, or I understand it was for the sake of prudence, but I do think part of what we're seeing today, which comes out of the destruction of the code and the rebellion against it that started in Hollywood in the 1950s, is a legitimate root in dissatisfaction with not being able to actually treat real subjects that require an actual, thorough Catholic moral treatment.
Right.
So I'm grateful. Yeah, I guess I'm repeating myself.
I mean, the code had weird things like you can't talk about like pregnancy you can't say the word pregnant and stuff like that. Just like there's some really weird stuff in the code.
Yeah, like even in the context of like a marital relationship on
Right.
screen,
Yeah.
and there was the classic, cliche of even married couples on screen in Hollywood movies would be depicted as having separate beds, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it's so it's kind of, I'm grateful for the general principles and making it clear. And I think there's a lot here for filmmakers of today to kind of take from and start to apply that afresh to our situation without, maybe going as far as the code did in some ways.
Right. So in the same section, Pius, goes on to talk about, all the embellishments of art that make cinema more powerful in being potentially able to corrupt people, especially the young, with the music and the realism and the spectacle and all of these different things. So he laments this moral havoc, the word he uses, on children. So I mean, again, I don't think we need to lean into that, but because I think in this discussion, because I think it's kind of obvious to our viewers that corrupting children by means of cinema is wrong.
I think there's one point I'd like to just draw out of that paragraph, which, is relevant in that I think when we read that, it's very easy to think, okay, well, all that really matters is the content. But he mentions the motion picture has enlisted in its service luxurious appointments, kind of like the seeing the ideal life or the rich life, everything has to be really nice and fancy, pleasing music, vigor of realism. Everything he describes here could be a definition of what we would call like commercial cinema or commercial mode cinema, or even just basically the kind of filmmaking you see in commercials themselves. And then of course in the most mainstream kind of commercial narrative films, at least in Hollywood, there's a certain sharpness to the image. There's a certain fluidity to it. It's pleasing. It's a very it doesn't put up any obstacles to your enjoyment. It's a very smooth experience. Right. And it's also very obviously obsessed with surfaces, with attractive surfaces. It's obsessed with kind of like the ideal life, materially. You see this in rom-coms. You see this in every, TV show. Suburban middle class family, it has the perfect kitchen with the marble countertops everywhere and all that. It's that's just still happening today, in all the media formats. And I think that presents a call to Catholic filmmakers, if our concern is representing reality and really being more in contact with reality in a way that awakens people to reality, we have a responsibility to treat these things in the form, as well as the content and the relationship between those two things, so that, and you don't necessarily see this in a lot of Christian media, often right. If the plots and the subject matter is kind of more family appropriate or Christian religiously themed, the setting, the people, the style, it's all very much in that commercial glossy mode. And it's kind of it's a step removed. And I think Pius the 11th, he wasn't intending to talk about that specifically, but I think he's hitting on that here. This is a thing we see all the way through, where it's very in our fallen nature, we're very attracted to these kind of glossy superficial.
Well, he does mention he does use phrases like the ideal life or the ideal of life a lot, whether it's corrupting the ideal of life or portraying a false ideal of life. So I think that the attractiveness of maybe it's just materialism or wealth or something, that could be something that films sort of lead people into as well, Mm-hmm. So I mean that's a good point, and I think that is something he's probably aware of. So part 3 and the third and final part of this encyclical is titled A Work for Catholic Action. So here's where he's really getting into the practical recommendations for Catholics to influence the film industry. So he starts off by talking about how he says the problem of production of moral films would be solved radically if it were possible for us to have production wholly inspired by the principles of Christian morality. And he goes on to say that we know how difficult it is to organize such an industry. So what he's saying is that it would be great if we had a Christian film industry that was like thoroughly imbued with Catholic principles. But he says, since we know how difficult it would be to do that, especially because of financial considerations, pastors of souls have to exercise their vigilance, he says, over all films, wherever they're produced and offered to Christians. And he says another reason for that is that it's necessary to influence basically you can't just have Christians making their own films and then society is flooded with, trash, for everybody else. It's like he says that we have a duty to influence the production of all films so that they will contain nothing harmful. So he kind of he likes the idea of having sort of Christians having their own work, but also he dislikes the idea of just sort of siloing off into a subculture that doesn't influence the rest of the culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to think about. There's a lot of interesting history here. We don't have time to go into all of it, but there were already efforts happening in the years leading up to this encyclical that the Pope was aware of, efforts to try to pull together Catholic resources, Catholic financing, in order to try to make some films, and they didn't work out. There was a lot of kind of false starts. Even at an industry level, there was a particular sound recording process called, I believe it was called Vitaphone, that a Catholic in Europe, I forget which country, invented in, at the start of the sound revolution, basically. And there was several years where there was, and the Vatican was kind of like involved, or at least organization it was sponsoring the office, the Catholic Office for Motion Pictures. That's not the actual title. I'm mangling the English version of the French. The OCIC is what the acronym is for it. Office Catholique International du Cinéma. They were involved with these kinds of startup projects, and it just didn't take off, and the money didn't really go anywhere. I guess partly because the industry is already was kind of going its own way, and it's hard to break in. But when the Pope is saying, like, hey, we know how hard it is to get this going, it's not just kind of an abstract statement. Like, there's already kind of like almost a decade of sort of attempts behind that, which I think is really interesting from today's perspective, because again, it's the same questions that we're facing today under different iterations. And this is what a lot of people are seeing right now with. A lot of people are wondering this about now about a company like Angel Studios, is kind of the new great hope for, Christian media. It's its own topic to treat some other day. But, these things they're cyclical. They just keep coming back. These questions keep coming back, which I think is interesting. And I think it's kind of consoling in a way to see that, they were dealing with this 100 years ago. It's right. Like nothing's really changed. I mean, there have been changes. There were some successes, mid-century with really trying to integrate a Catholic ethos of cinema with, the industry and with the festival world and stuff like that. But that hasn't necessarily persisted. So where these problems are kind of perennial, I guess, is maybe the takeaway that I have from that.
Yeah. And, another thing he says is that bishops should periodically reach out to Catholics in the motion picture industry to exhort them to use their influence in accordance with their faith. And again, this is something that I think the church just used to do so much of a better job of doing. The pastor used to like really take responsibility for the people within his parish boundaries, the Catholic people, and to sort of, there was much more of a sense that he knew what they were up to. Obviously, like, society has changed so much. The idea of a parish has changed so much that since then, it's not that this is like as feasible now as it was then. But, I think bishops were much more likely to sort of have tabs on, the prominent people, within their ranks. Now, of course, any bishop worth his salt today is going to know who, the Catholics who have money and could potentially donate to support the building of churches and things like that. That hasn't changed. But I don't know that there's as much of a sense of like bishops sort of like really taking the initiative to reach out to like actors who maybe are imperfect, but like, you know, are publicly identifying themselves as Catholic and like at least like seem to be like semi serious about it. But maybe could use some guidance and some like exhortation, you know. I think that, you know, look, a lot of it is just the matter of fact that the church has less influence on the culture, but I don't even see the church really taking advantage of the people who do identify as Catholic and really sort of like reaching out and trying to work with them actively. So, you know, it's just a note. But I think there's a lot of little things in here that are just indicative of where the church was and where the culture was at the time that are interesting.
Yeah, just on that note, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think there's a real siloing that's been happening, and you see, you know, obviously specific ministries, like obviously Word on Fire would be an example of a ministry that's like reaching out to have that engagement, but it's only kind of in that curious, that the sort of interview, cultural engagement model. It's not so much necessarily in the way that a bishop would maybe challenge one of the flock to step up in a certain way, though I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure that is happening maybe at a quieter level in some cases, but it is, I wonder if because so much of the stuff is situated in the industry centers, you know, New York, LA, like maybe, maybe the assumption is that's where all the creatives are. And so your ordinary bishop, who's not the bishop of those two cities, is kind of doesn't really have to worry about it, or doesn't have, you know, film people around to really deal with, which isn't the case. It's obviously film people are all over. But I just want to tie that in quickly as well to what he was saying about they must make full use of the technical ability of experts and not permit the waste of effort and of money by the employment of amateurs, is what the English says. I want to, in the Latin version, actually, I think it's important to emphasize amateur isn't really used. It's kind of more, the Latin is emphasizing that things should be done to the best of the technical proficiency. It should be the best. So it's the same point. But I think one thing that the English version here is kind of maybe clouding a bit is the idea that not that okay, this is a bigger, maybe too bigger topic for today. But
yeah, let's watch out because we only have so much time.
Amateur cinema is this kind of whole area where, you know, that's kind of like the proving ground. That's the place where you know talent can kind of be trained and informed. And I think the church could have a much more active hand in really identifying amateur talent, amateur efforts, and really trying to form that into a more proficient way. But, you know, without making, I think the risk of reading that statement as sort of like pros only, no amateurs, you know, is kind of, again, giving too much maybe credence to the industry, you know, for the virtues of professionalism and all that, when we're kind of at least today, we're in a world where the tools of filmmaking are available to pretty much anybody who has enough money to buy a decent like 6K camera, which, you know, would be like $3,000 or $4,000. So it's not, you know, nothing, but it's never been more affordable to make professional cinema quality kind of cinema at a low budget. And we could be doing a lot more to utilize that across, you know, the church.
I touched on this point earlier, but he mentions at this point, he says, why indeed should there be a question of merely avoiding what is evil? The motion picture should not be simply a means of diversion, a light relaxation to occupy an idle hour. With its magnificent power, it can and must be a bearer of light and a positive guide to what is good. So I think that sort of points forward to what we're going to discuss in the Pius XII episode, because he gets a lot more into the details of the art form and its sort of positive power. Okay, so his practical recommendation is basically to suggest that that all pastors everywhere will annually get their people to take a pledge similar to the one that he already mentioned, given by a lot of Americans under the Legion of Decency, a pledge to promise to stay away from motion pictures that are offensive to truth and to Christian morality. And he says the fulfillment of this pledge supposes that the people be told plainly which films are permitted to all, which are permitted with reservations, and which are harmful or positively bad. And that this requires basically press activity, the publication of classified lists of motion pictures, so he suggests on that point that in each country the bishop should set up a national reviewing office, that is, I think, what the USDCB did. I think that's defunct now, right? But so that's pretty much it. He mentions that people should take this pledge to stay away from movies that are offensive to truth and to Christian morality. And so, I mean, that touches on something that we've discussed before about like the differing approach of the old, Catholic world versus like the Vatican film list, which, some of those films, at least one of the films was condemned, by the Legion. Whereas the Vatican film list is taking a much different approach to, then like blanket avoidance versus, discerning viewing, or maybe it's just that the threshold is a lot higher for what is considered like acceptable with reservations versus totally condemned, I guess. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. But any further final comments, Nathan?
No, I think that about covers it. Maybe the only thing that comes to mind is, as we'll get into with the next episode, film is a constantly evolving art form, and what we see in the church's grappling with it is an attempt to reflect that, to grapple with it. And I think we can definitely see through the magisterial documents, starting with this one and going forward, again, like seeing the general bird's eye principles. There is a lot of room for filmmakers. I would say I would encourage other Catholic filmmakers out there, if you want to study this stuff, and I would encourage you to definitely like familiarize yourself with it, take it in, absorb it, but also understand like there's a lot of room here for, the artistic development of the medium. I think we should be excited to like return to this text and return to the other texts and really start to, imagine like the breadth. I think the thing is that the difference between today and 1930s is we understand much more possibilities about what film can do, especially as a medium that aids the spiritual life. So I think we should be excited and interpret these things from an artistic point of view. Like, I think there's a lot to work with here.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to discussing the Apostolic Exhortation on the Ideal Film by Pope Pius XII, which is what we'll do next time, as well as his encyclical Miranda Prorsus. And that Apostolic Exhortation is the most interesting of these documents to read, and the most sort of like in depth about film as an artistic medium. So I think that will be a great one to discuss, and probably the one that I would most recommend reading to people who actually want to follow up and read these documents. So we'll talk about that in a couple weeks, I guess. But for now, thanks, Nathan, for joining me.
Thanks, Thomas. Always a pleasure.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.